And what we can take a look at now is setting up our camera shake if we want to have any. So I'm just going to bring this back to frame 0, switch this to our perspective view, and I'm going to load in a null object. So we can just go to Items, Object, Null, and I'm going to call this Camera Null. And first what I'm going to do is go to our camera. Now we have our view camera, M for motion, and we can see that right now we have the View xStream controller loaded in for our modifier. So that's the plugins that is being used to synchronize back and forth between the programs. But I want to have a parent item for our null that we have in here, so camera null. So we're going to go into the camera view, and we want to start setting up just a little bit of jitter. And just that camera shake starting out just a little bit before the particles start showing up in the scene, and then of course increasing that amount as we move through. Now there are plugins that are available for this, but sometimes when working with the xStream synchronization, it might cause Lightwave to crash. So I like to just do this manually, and it's really not a lot of work, so it's not that large of a deal that we can't use the available plugin for that. So we'll start out halfway, or just a little before halfway. We're going to go to frame 50, and what I want to do is just create a key, and for our selected item, and I'm going to do this for position and rotation. Now we can see that keyframe is set. Now what we can do is do this frame by frame. Usually that's something you want to do a little bit later into the animation. We just want a little tiny bit of jitter right now, nothing major. So I'm going to move a few frames in to frame 53, and I just want to move our camera up just a little bit. Actually, I'm going to undo both of those and get a setting that's a little less of a movement. And we can just rotate the camera a little. So now we just got a little bit of motion, and we're going to go at around frame 58 this time. And kind of move that back. Go to our position, and we can move it down. And then if that's too much motion, we can always modify what we have set. I'm going to go a few more frames in, switch to our rotation mode, rotate that a little bit more, and then I'm just going to move along the scene and just kind of do that, increasing the amounts overall as I move along. And now I've just got it kind of set up where we have a nice amount of shake at the end and just a little towards the beginning. And if you notice, we've got that bit of camera movement as we're flowing into the first keyframe, and whether or not you want the camera to be stationary at that point is really entirely up to you. If we need to correct that, we can just go to the graph editor, and then those first key points and keyframes that we have for each of our different settings, all we would need to do is just right mouse click on it and set that to linear. And that will have no effect then until we reach the next keyframe. And basically there will be absolutely no camera movement until we reach all of those keyframes. But personally I kind of like that little tiny bit of movement we have. It's not a whole lot, just enough to kind of shift things around. What I want to do is just render out a preview of this so that we can see timing and if that really looks good enough. But first what I want to do is turn on our particles for basically the preview geometry. So I'm going to hit Control F6 and open up hypervoxels. And under geometry, I'm going to click Show Particles. And now I'm going to create an OpenGL preview. Go to the lower right, Preview, Make Preview. First frame 0, last frame 120. Although technically our first frame should really be 1, because we will be rendering from 1 to 120 instead of from 0. And I'm going to set the frame step to 2, and the reason for that is it won't take as long to render, and that way we can play it at half speed, getting 15 frames per second, rendering every other frame, and it'll give us a good representation of the animation without having to render every single frame. So I'm going to click OK, and then that's going to generate our OpenGL preview. And depending on the settings that you have, it'll save in different compression formats. So you can open up the preview options for that, which we can take a look at if you want to change certain settings. But now that this is done, what we can do is just move down our controls so we can see the full scene, and I'm going to change this to half size. And everything's blank right now as well, but once I click play, it'll start to show up. And now we can watch the animation at the actual frame rate and time that we need to have it set, because it is rendered out, and that way we don't need to worry about system lag based on refreshing the OpenGL preview, because this is all rendered out and saved into an AVI format or whichever format you've selected. And of course, because the tutorial itself is a little bit of a different frame rate than what's being displayed, you might not be able to see this in full, but overall it looks really good. A lot of camera shake at the end. It might be a little bit too much, you might want to tone it down, but you can just kind of play around with it until it looks right. So I'm going to end preview. And if we take a look at our preview options, we can take a look at some of the different settings for this. We can choose the codec we'd like to use to save this, the different encoding types that we have available, whether or not we'd like to interlace it. Most of the default settings usually work really well if you have enough RAM on your system. If you're working with a little lower amount of memory, you might want to adjust those different settings, or even just render as a wireframe, which will definitely cut back on the amount of system resources used.